very easy to come here and talk and show you 20 whiz-bag things about health technology, and you walk out of the room and in a month's time you've forgotten all that. What I want to do is give you some models for thinking about that so you can use it in your business in the next few months. I'm going to talk up at the top about all of the things that are driving sort of development around digital technologies. The future of health is a huge subject, and so we're just going to talk about this slice of digital technologies. Talk about the response in relation to AI and collaboration, and then end up with some of the impacts and opportunities for you guys in this space. You guys are all futurists. You've all got some capacity to think about the future. If you go out in the street there, yes, behind me, if you go out in the street there and try and cross the road without the lights, you're projecting yourself in the future. You're going, I know how fast I can move, or in my case, how fast I think I can move. I'm slower than I was. I know how fast that car or bus is moving. I'm going to see whether I can cross the road or not. The trouble is those capacities developed thousands and thousands of years ago when most of the threats we faced as humans were physical threats. So if you heard a rustle in the bushes over there and you were a bit worried about it, you didn't sit down and have a strategic planning meeting as how to respond. I did that with a not-for-profit conference one day, and a guy at the back put his hand up straight away and said, yeah, well, we would actually, our organisation would. But, and probably we're not very good at strategic planning to this day because all the people that did sit down and do that were killed immediately, and we wiped out those genes. So what happens was we became very, very efficient pattern recognition machines because it was really important to an evolutionary sense in terms of survival to respond quickly to information and make decisions. But the trouble is those threats aren't really facing you 99.999% of the time these days, and so we need a different way of thinking. The trouble is our brains are still in there, having evolved and not changed much over the last thousands of years. So we get things like this, because we're very good at recognising patterns, or more disturbingly this. Someone's seen that before. That's an ultrasound of a man's testicle. Because we're very, very good at recognising faces, because who is on our side and who's not on our side was a very important thing. We need new ways of thinking about things if we're going to go forward into the future. So Gary Klein, the decision-making specialist in the US, who's done a lot of work in first responders, particularly ambulance firefighters, talks about the difference between intuition and insight. And intuition is the recognition of old patterns, the ways of, I've seen this before, I've got a gut feeling about what this is, and that informs a lot of decisions we make. But insight is the recognition of new patterns. So it's very important when we think about disruptive change that we get more insight and less use of intuition. I'm not saying abandon intuition, but I'm saying that insight becomes more important. So I want to share with you a model quickly that we use. I do it for two reasons. One, we find it very useful. Secondly, that guy, that's his Twitter handle, Simon Wardley, on the left-hand side, works for the Leading Edge Foundation in the UK. He says they pay him enough money, and so he gives all this stuff away for free. So if you like the model, you can actually look it up, and there's a whole lot of free resources you can use. And essentially what it says is that every technology, every business practice, every new way of doing things evolves from the left-hand side of that map to the right-hand side of the map. So we have genesis, or this novel new idea. We have custom-built models we make from that idea. Then we move to sort of a product model where everyone's competing, trying to sell you products. And finally to a utility-type model where everything is ubiquitous, works really well, is cheap, and just becomes in the background of doing business. So to use an example that everyone in the room would be familiar with around technology, that's Ada Lovelace, the first programmer of software. And underneath that is Charles Babbage's difference engine or analytic engine. So that was the idea of computers. And in fact, the architecture of that machine is still the basic architecture of modern computers. Secondly, we move into, say, the 1970s, and we had lots of custom-built models. That's Gordon French, who was the founder of the homebrew computer model clubs, where people got together, put stuff together, built things, soldered stuff, and made things. And that's credited with a huge explosion at the next stage of Apple and a whole range of things. That innovation and things that were tried there created a huge amount of change. So then you end up with a product model. There's Dell computers, IBM, whatever you want to do about that, where everything starts to work. You buy a box, you bring it home, you plug it in, and everything works. For the younger people in the audience, you do that now, but when I was starting off my veterinary career, I had this portable laptop, and when you tried to plug that into a printer or something, sometimes it could take you 3 hours to make that work, but that's back in the 80s. And finally, you get to something like Amazon Web Services, which is basically computer as a service. So you plug stuff in, it works, you don't own the machines, you just buy the service. So everything moves inexorably to the right. And what happens then, though, is you can build new stuff on top of that. So if you think about Netflix, Netflix basically is not possible without Amazon Web Services because it's totally built on top of that. I did some work a few months ago for the property exchange, PEXA, the new property digital exchange in Melbourne, and they've completely swapped their whole system over onto Amazon Web Services. So these systems don't work at scale and work well without those sort of things. And once you do that, then the cycle continues and you can start innovating again. So I'll come back to that in the model when I talk about a couple of things in health now. That is a mess of the NHS system in Wales. The guy on the right, Mark Wardle, is a neurologist, but also is chair of the Technical Standards Committee in the NHS in Wales. But if you take that mess and put it into this sort of model, you can start thinking more constructively about it. I won't go through all of it, but it says we can position where those technologies are, we can think about where they might go, we can decide what to build ourselves, we can decide what to buy, we can decide what to outsource. So now let's go to some more specifically around health. We've got the Internet of Things in terms of a trend, so there's lots of reports out there like this, so the actual number doesn't matter exactly, don't worry about that. But huge development in this market, you know, Fitbits, sensors in houses, a whole range of things. The important bit too is that not that $1 trillion, it's that a very small percentage of that $1 trillion is related to the hardware and the connectivity. Where most of the value is going to be built there is actually the services built on top of that to deliver value to customers. The second factor here is personalised medicine. So we're a long way from the completion of the Human Genome Project that promised a lot in its early days about how things would change, and Kate talked about the genetic testing for her mother. We're finally getting to this stage where a lot of this is starting to bear fruit. So we're going to get increasing levels of personalised medicine based on our genomes. And the last part, which sort of ties it all together, is digitisation. Because unless we can put all this information in a form we can manipulate and do something with it, it doesn't really work. And this paper was published in May in Nature as a project looking at hospitalisations with electronic health records. And what it showed was that the AI could improve predictions of things like risk of mortality, risk of unexpected return to hospital after leaving hospital. And the interesting thing from that point of view is it didn't just use electronic health records, it actually used handwritten notes from nurses, doctors, other health professionals in that process. And I'll come back to that in a moment, talking about the details later. So what we've got is this sort of tsunami of data coming towards us, and what I worry about is that the health system, which is struggling under the load it currently has, is going to have an increasing load. So how do we look at trying to deal with that? And I think that's two things. It's AI and it's human collaboration. So when I say AI, I don't mean this. We're a long, long way from any sort of general intelligence doing something. What I mean is this. And what I mean by that is specific tools that can do specific things. So, you know, we don't tend to, we won't build a generalised AI that's going to replace a doctor or a nurse or a dentist or a physio or whatever it may be in a robotic form. We build tools that replace individual skills. An example is this. So the FDA has started a fast-track process of approving applications which are powered by AI. So this is the diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy, which has been approved. There's 2 others been approved, but they've also got a fast-track program now, so they're accelerating it. So you think about that Wardley map I talked about before, more and more coming out of custom-built models and becoming products and applications you can use. Now, there's been some criticism of the FDA in this space because some of these things they've approved or are in the approval process have not been published in peer-reviewed journals before they've got to that process. But just last week, this was published in Nature, And this was Google's DeepMind project, looking at a 2-year project where they have trained an AI to diagnose retinal problems. And they have over 50 individual retinal problems in that study where they have proven that the AI is better at diagnosis than the humans. Now, none of those are approved yet, but it's in a peer-reviewed journal as these things are moving quite rapidly from out of that sort of genesis idea to over here. It took 2 years to get there, but the point here is that once you train something to do that stuff, you can use that material to then have 1 million of those machines capable of doing that. You don't have to train doctor after doctor or ophthalmologist about that. So I think AI is going to help us. We will have AI assistants. We'll have increasing levels of democratisation of some of these testing systems, which will push those capabilities. If we think about specialists over here and GPs or individual allied health people over here, will push it more to the edge in that process. But we're also going to need collaboration. And what I mean by collaboration here is that about collaboration between patients, collaboration between insurers and researchers and allied health professionals, collaboration between all sectors of the health system. Because we've all heard that story about, I'm from Melbourne, there's a child has gone to the Royal Children's Hospital and there's been a very rare genetic issue that they don't know how to deal with, and the parents have gone out and scoured the world and got research organised and a whole range of things. We're going to see more and more of that, but on an industrialised scale. Because if we have individuals with personalised genome data and we have all of this data around what's going on in their lives through Internet of Things, we're going to cut the patient groups up into smaller and smaller, more specialised groups. So we need some sort of collaboration. This is meetup.com, which people use online to create real-world meetups. So you can say, I'm going to be in Brisbane next week, who wants to come for drinks or whatever it may be. Who knows what the biggest user group in the world was a year after that app was launched? And this is true, the actual answer was witches. The reason for that is if you're a witch in Roma, right? No, don't go there. There are not many other witches you can hang out with. No, I'm telling you there aren't. But if you can connect up with all the witches all around the world, then you've got your peeps. The same thing is if you're you've got a model train set in your basement and you're a 55-year-old bloke or whatever, there's probably not too many of them either, but you can find them again in the world. We need collaboration because we're going to have more and more of these groups, and getting patients to actually work with each other and work with the health system is one way we can actually deal with this tsunami in my view. So, what are the impacts or the implications for you guys with these changes? The first of these is that we'll have changing value in relation to skills. And the first of those is information. So if the machines, if you look at that Google DeepMind project, if you look at those things, if more and more the machines take over the capacity of the information and data which is in our heads, then the value of people who hold lots of information in their heads will be lower than it was. I'm not saying it's unimportant, I'm just saying the relative value of it falls. Secondly, the capacity of people to facilitate and collaborate. So collaborate with each other, facilitate networks is going to become more important because that's more important than information relatively in this modern world. And lastly, just the capacity to deal with change. So, those 3 apps have come out from the FDA or been approved by the FDA. In Google Mind then saying we've got 50 more for retinal problems, and that'll continue to raise, and we'll push more and more stuff to that right-hand side, and you'll get an acceleration. And what that means is because those things replace specific skills rather than an individual person, it changes the business model all of the time. So you're going to have to go through continual change about how your business model works and how the activities work around that. So the capacity to actually deal with change is going to massively increase in my view. And there's a thing here about scale, about what does this mean for large organisations, practices, individual practitioners. And what I would say is that scale matters, but it's not critical in all areas. So if we go back to that Nature article about that predictive capacity of the hospital stays, the reason I put up this sentence is that last number. That system looked at 47 billion data points in its actual prediction capacity. You're not going to do that in your individual GP practice. It's just not possible, right? You've got Amazon in the pharmacy industry buying PillPack in the US using computer vision systems and automation systems to look at trying to improve how that works in a pharmacy sense. Some of that may devolve to individual pharmacies in the future because everything moves to the right eventually, but you can't do that individually at this stage. And then you've got things like this that says, okay, that can devolve, that can be something which doesn't have to be worked at scale. Certainly you need that bit of kit to make this work, but if you can afford the bit of kit and the actual testing process becomes cheaper, then one thing it does is reduce the cost of that. Because previously in that system you used to have to go to a specialist for that diagnostic process. If you can push that to the edge and make it cheaper, then more people will do it earlier, and there's a chance for all sorts of business models to be built around that in a preventative space, etc. Because if it makes it easier and cheaper for people to do, more people will do it, and new ideas about how to actually work with those people come forward. And then you get things like this, so AI looking at drug combinations, because we only really touch the surface of all the possible drug combination problems. And this is something which is likely to be at scale up at a government sort of research level, but go out to everybody as an application to be used, rather than you doing it yourself individually. And the thing is that regulation, because you work in a high-risk environment, and inconsistent data sets mean this is going to be slower than other sectors. So that's not a caveat. I'm not saying, walk away and forget about it. It still is going to happen relatively quickly, but it's going to be slower than some of the other changes you've seen. So to finish, 4 opportunities for you to think about as you walk out. First of all, continually map the landscape. That model I showed you before is one we use your own, that's fine, but this is going to change and continue to change on a fairly rapid basis, and the only way you'll keep on top of this and be ahead of your competitors in this space is to actually continually think about what that looks like. Why is it changing? Where are all the components moving? What new ideas can we have? What am I seeing? As I said before, if you have that FDA application as an example, that if you're in an allied health practice or a GP practice, that gives you capacity to do stuff you haven't before, and there'll be more and more of that comes out over the next 5 years. Cost reductions provide opportunities. You may be making a lower margin on a service because it's become more automated and more efficient, but the other services or value you can build on top of that can become even more valuable for your business, and more importantly, more valuable for your patient. And I think there's going to be opportunities for patient networks and collaborations out there that no one really understands how to do yet. So experiment in that space and look for ideas. It's going to be hard to actually create value out of those, but I think there's going to be a myriad of opportunities for those that can think a little bit differently and turn that around and think about how that benefits patients, but also creates value for business. Thanks very much.